My next guest on the program is Dr. Robert L. Hirsch. And Bob, I want to go back to a study that you did back in 2005 for the U.S. government called The Peaking of World Oil Production Impact and Mitigation. When you did that study in 2005, and I want to come back to 2005 as a key year, you outlined three scenarios for peak oil. The best scenario is we would take mitigation steps 20 years before the event happened. The next best scenario was 10 years, and the worst scenario is it sneaks up on us and we do nothing. I guess since that study, what impact did your study have with the government in reference to mitigation strategies, and were any of your recommendations implemented?
There was nothing that was implemented, and I find it difficult to say what the impact was on the government because shortly after we completed that study and a follow-on study, there was a freeze in the government on any more funded work on peak oil. And that's something that I found from a number of sources in the government. And the problem, of course, is that this is really a frightening story, and the folks who were running things in the Department of Energy and elsewhere at that time did not want any work in this area, and they didn't want public discussion. So that happened then, and with the new administration, we're seeing essentially the same thing. In other words, folks are really trying to duck this subject because it is a bad news subject, and I suppose people feel that there's enough bad news out there already.
You know, I guess related to this story, there was the UK Guardian did a story about an IEA whistleblower that they were basically cooking their numbers, and the implication was pressure was being brought down on the IEA from the U.S. government. So this would almost line up with what you're telling me here about cutting back of any kind of funding for studying this. Now, in your report, you warned of waiting until oil production peaks. It would leave the world with a significant liquid fuel deficit for more than 2 decades. When we talk about green energy, and you saw this during the presidential election when they were talking about being energy independent, we were going to build wind farms, solar arrays. I think, Bob, the issue of peak oil gets confused because we mainly have a liquid fuel issue. A wind turbine isn't going to help power my car or truck. And essentially our entire transportation system, whether you're talking about trains, boats, planes, cars, all runs on liquid fuels.
I think you've said it very well. People tend to lump all of energy together, and when they talk about windmills or solar cells doing something to impact oil, they're not differentiating the fact that there's a huge amount of capital equipment in the United States and the world that is built to operate on liquid fuels, and it cannot operate on electricity. People don't seem to grasp that to replace some of that equipment with electric-powered units or systems, in fact, would take a long time and cost an enormous amount of money. And since we're talking about sliding into a deep recession when peak oil actually hits, it's going to be all the more difficult to do that kind of substitution. So many people have generally a superficial view of what's involved. They think energy is energy, but in fact, oil is oil. And energy includes oil, but energy is much more than oil.
Now, we got a warning in this decade when oil prices rose from $10 a barrel in 1998 all the way to $147 a barrel in the summer of 2008. But in that, our politicians in the media responded. They blamed oil companies and speculators, which really obfuscated the risk that was involved. And especially when we saw oil prices go from 147 to 32. I can think of one prominent cable news anchor was saying, see, it was the speculators all along, I told you.
People don't understand what's going on, and they apply criteria that they use to talk about more normal kinds of trade and commerce to oil. And indeed, oil has many differences, fundamental differences. So you can't look at left-handed widgets and the market for widgets and draw a parallel with the oil business. It just doesn't work that way. People don't understand the fundamentals of what's involved. They also don't understand the enormous size of world oil production and consumption and the enormous size of the consumption in the United States. They also have a tendency to look at the big oil companies like Exxon, and of course Exxon is a huge organization, and not realize that Exxon, in fact, is a bit player in the world oil business. As big as they are, and they are huge, they represent only a few percent of world oil production. People have a very difficult time grasping that. It's an illustration of how large the business really is.
In 2008, unfortunately, the IEA released a major study that was done on, I think it was the 800 largest oil fields in the world. And that study revealed that the depletion rates from these wells was a lot larger and running at a higher rate than originally thought. Unfortunately, it was released at the time of the credit crisis, so it was buried in the back pages. However, to optimists, I always find it amazing that still today we're finding about 1 barrel of oil for every 4 to 5 that we consume. And Bob, you would think that anybody that understands simple inventory management, I have X amount of barrels in the warehouse, I have sold X amount of barrels, but I'm not having new trucks coming in with the barrels that I replace, that would get somebody's attention that there is a problem here. And anytime you talk to, I call them the cornucopians, whether you're talking to the folks at Sarah, they always have this, there's all this oil out there to be found, so we don't have a problem. But this has been going on, at least correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's been going on now for close to 2 decades?
Well, it's been going on actually longer than that, the discussion and the misunderstanding. We have a book that's going to come out in September entitled The Impending World Energy Mess, and a good fraction of it is devoted to oil, trying to help people, non-oil people, to understand what's really involved. Oil reserves, oil in the ground is not like inventory in a situation like a warehouse or something of that sort. It's very, very different. And so people need to grasp that. And it's not an easy thing to grasp because the way the oil business and oil production works is different than any of us see in our everyday life and the things that most of us are exposed to.
I want to move on to the issue that we seem to be preoccupied with currently, and that's the issue of the BP oil spill. The one issue that I think I have not seen addressed by the media, and a question that nobody ever asks, why are we drilling for oil in deep water in places we've never been before if there are all these vast undiscovered barrels of oil out there to be found? We wouldn't be drilling offshore if we have a lot more oil onshore, because onshore oil is a lot easier to drill and produce than deep water.
Well, I think your question and your point answers itself. The reason that people are doing what they're doing and spending the enormous amount of money that they are and taking the huge risks that they have to take to drill in very deep water is because there isn't that much left in other places. There is oil in deep water in the United States and elsewhere in the world. There's not enough oil in those areas to solve the problem that we have now, but it certainly helps. And for companies that are trying to stay in business and continue to produce oil, that represents their best opportunity. And very simply, because it is so dangerous and so expensive, it tells you something about the character of what's left throughout the world.
Something that has impressed me this year, if you and I were having a conversation about peak oil 10 years ago, people would look at us as being somewhat fringe. In fact, when we first discussed it in 2001, we were called fringe. But since the beginning of this year, we've seen the UK Energy Institute issue a report on peak oil. That was followed up in February by the UK Task Force. In March, we saw Oxford University and the University of Kuwait come out with 2 reports confirming each other. In April, we had the U.S. military. Now, this one was really striking. They said by 2015, we could have a shortfall of 10 million barrels a day. And then in the month of June, we had Chatham House along with Lloyd's of London come out with a report, once again, like the UK Task Force, saying, folks, from 2011 to 2015, we've got a major problem on our hands concerning peak oil. I have to take my hat off to the Brits. I don't know if it's been picked up in the U.S. as much.
Brits have a good deal of momentum going. Richard Branson was directly involved in one of the studies, and there were two that he and his task force did, and both indicated trouble ahead. And Branson, because he's a notable figure there and elsewhere in the world, was able to get the attention of the government, and the government actually had a private discussion, not of when this might occur, but what it is the UK might do as a result. The problem that you have in the UK, just like the problems that you have here, is that people are right now deeply concerned about the existing recession, and there's a lot of pain and suffering out there now, and to open up the bucket of worms that's associated with the decline of world oil production, which is not going to be that much farther into the future, is to bring even more pain. And the question then becomes, do you shut up and just let it happen, or do you speak up early in order to get people attuned to what's coming and begin to take the action that you need to mitigate the problem? And there's just a whole lot of people in politics that would rather shut up and ignore the problem for now and hope it doesn't happen until after they're someplace else.
I want to come back to something that you said when we were talking about the rise in oil in 2008, where the oil companies and speculators were blamed, and you talk about people have a hard time grasping as big as ExxonMobil is. They're a small fraction. And it's interesting, in the July issue of Petroleum Review, they tackled this very same issue, the rise of the National Oil Company, and they went back, Bob, and they took a look at oil production in 1972, and at the very top of the list was Exxon, British Petroleum, Royal Dutch, the Seven Sisters. By 1995, only two of these international oil companies were in the top 10. By 2006, it was still the same two oil companies, and they only were in that top 10, BP and ExxonMobil, because of mergers. Exxon buying Mobil, BP buying Amoco. And it's amazing that these companies only have, about 10% of the world's oil reserves. So almost 90% of the world's oil lies with companies, or let's say entities, that are no longer dominated by Western companies.
And all of that occurred relatively slowly. There was no huge event that caught people's attention. These things happened relatively slowly, and people were concerned about other things, so they didn't particularly take note and get deeply concerned about that change. But the point is exactly right, that as things stand today, and in fact the words of the former head of the American Petroleum Institute, is that it's no longer big oil, the international oil companies that we think about, Exxon and Shell and Chevron and so forth. They're really baby oil. And indeed, as big as they are still tiny compared to the other entities that control world oil production. And those other entities, not all of them are happy with us. You hear threats periodically. And besides that, a number of those entities are not telling the truth in terms of what production they actually have.